The rope creaked like a dying animal in the dawn wind, and Cordell Hawthorne dropped his axe with a curse that echoed off the pine-covered slopes. There she was, a woman in a torn blue dress, swaying from the roof beam of what used to be the Henderson place, her golden hair catching the first light like spun wheat. But it wasn't the sight of her that made his blood run cold. It was the words burned deep into the wooden shingles above her head. Apache Lover. Cordell had been cutting firewood for winter when he spotted the smoke 3 days back, figuring another settler's cabin had caught flame from a poorly tended hearth. Now, standing in the ash-dusted yard with his heart hammering against his ribs, he understood this was something far worse than carelessness. The woman's eyes fluttered open as he reached for his hunting knife to cut her down. Blue as mountain sky, they fixed on his face with a desperation that hit him harder than any Apache war club. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear over the wind, and Cordell found himself running toward the cabin like a man possessed. "Hold. On there, darling," he called up to her, his weathered hands shaking as he climbed onto the porch roof. The rope was new hemp, tied with the kind of knots he'd seen in cattle camps' professional work. That meant this wasn't some crime of passion, but cold-blooded judgment. As his blade parted the fibers, she collapsed into his arms like a broken bird. Her skin was pale as birch bark except for the angry red marks around her throat, and when she tried to speak, only a harsh whisper emerged. They killed him," she managed, her fingers clutching at Cordell's buckskin shirt. "My Ayana. They killed my beautiful Ayana." The name hit Cordell like a physical blow. He knew that name, knew it belonged to the Apache brave who'd been trading peacefully with the settlement for months, bringing rabbit pelts and beadwork in exchange for flour and coffee. The same brave who disappeared a week ago, along with 3 horses from the Garrett Ranch. "Who did this to you?" Cordell asked, though he suspected he already knew. The Vigilance Committee had been meeting in secret for months, their talk growing uglier each time Apache tracks were found near missing livestock. "Jeremiah Caldwell and his men," she whispered, her voice breaking like autumn leaves. "They said I was corrupting the settlement, that I was teaching other women to lie with savages." Cordell's jaw tightened. He'd heard the whispers about Vera Lightwood, the school teacher who'd arrived from Boston 2 summers back. Folks said she was too friendly with the natives, too willing to learn their ways. But he'd also seen how she tended sick children regardless of their color, how she shared her food with anyone hungry enough to ask. "Can you ride?" he asked, glancing toward the tree line where shadows moved in ways that made his neck prickle. Nodded weakly, and Cordell swept her up in his arms, carrying her toward his cabin hidden deep in the mountains where the Vigilance Committee's reach couldn't follow. Behind them, smoke still rose from the Henderson place, and somewhere in the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs of loss and longing. The fever took hold of Vera 2 days after Cordell brought her to his mountain refuge, and for a week, she drifted between consciousness and delirium, calling out for her Apache lover in words that mixed English with phrases from the native tongue. Cordell tended her with the patience of a man who understood suffering, spooning broth between her cracked lips and cooling her burning skin with water from the mountain spring. His cabin sat in a hidden valley where ancient pines grew thick as secrets, their branches forming a canopy so dense that smoke from his chimney dispersed before it could be seen from below. He'd built this sanctuary 5 years back, after his wife and daughter died of the fever, needing a place where grief couldn't find him. Now, watching Vera fight her own demons, he wondered if solitude had been medicine or poison for his wounded soul. "Ayana was teaching me to braid sweetgrass," she murmured during one lucid moment, her blue eyes focusing on Cordell's weathered face. "He said it would help me understand the earth's heartbeat." Cordell stirred the rabbit stew simmering over his fire, remembering the Apache brave's gentle manner, The way he'd spoken of his ancestors with reverence that put most churchgoers to shame. "Sounds like a good man," he said quietly. He was. Tears tracked down her pale cheeks. They dragged him from my cabin at dawn, called him a thief and worse. I tried to stop them, but Caldwell ... He struck me down, said I'd lost my Christian soul to savage ways. The mountain man's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. He'd known Jeremiah Caldwell since boyhood, remembered when the man had been decent. Enough before power and fear twisted him into something ugly. Now Caldwell led the Vigilance Committee like a general commanding troops, dispensing frontier justice with hemp rope and burning brands. "They hanged him from the old oak by Miller's Creek," Vera continued, her voice breaking. "Made me watch. While they did it, said if I ever spoke his name again, I'd join him." Cordell felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, like ice forming over a still pond. He'd spent 5 years running from the world's cruelties, but some evils couldn't be outrun. They had to be faced with steel and fire. "You're safe here," he told her, though they both knew safety was a temporary thing in a world gone mad with him. Hatred. "Nobody knows about this place but me and the wolves." She studied his face in the firelight, taking in the scars that mapped his years of solitary living, the gray threading through his dark hair, the gentleness in his brown eyes that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "The whole settlement thinks him corrupted." Cordell ladled stew into a wooden bowl, his movements deliberate and sure. "Because I knew your Apache brave. Traded with him once when my horse threw a shoe near his camp. He helped me fix it, wouldn't take payment except for some coffee beans. That's not the action of a horse thief." He handed her the bowl, their fingers brushing in a way that made unexpected warmth bloom in both their chests. "And because," he added quietly, "love ain't something to be ashamed of, no matter what form it takes." Outside, night wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate with a loneliness that echoed in both their hearts. 3 weeks passed before Vera was strong enough to venture beyond Cordell's cabin, and when she finally stepped into the morning sunlight, the mountain man felt his breath catch in his chest. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her golden hair shimmered like captured starlight as she turned her face toward the peaks that surrounded their hidden valley. "It's beautiful here," she said, her voice carrying wonder instead of the broken whispers he'd grown accustomed to. "Like God's own secret garden." Cordell felt heat rise in his neck as he watched her explore the clearing, touching pine bark with fingers that had once braided sweetgrass with her Apache Lover. Somewhere during those fever-bright nights of tending her, something had shifted in his carefully guarded heart, and now her presence filled spaces in his soul he'd thought permanently empty. "Ayanna would have loved this place," she said, settling, "on a sun-warmed boulder near the stream that fed his valley. He always said the mountains held the spirits of his ancestors." The name no longer brought visible pain to her features, though Cordell could see grief still moved beneath the surface. Like currents in deep water. She spoke of her lost love easily now, sharing memories that painted pictures of stolen moments and forbidden tenderness. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly, her blue eyes meeting his with gentle directness. "You mentioned her during my fever when you thought I was sleeping." Cordell's hand stilled on the fishing line he'd been repairing. "Margaret? We had 6 good years together, built a life in the valley below before the fever came through. Lost our little girl, Rosalie, first. She was only 4, had her mother's laugh and my stubborn streak." He paused, watching water flow over smooth stones, carrying autumn leaves toward distant rivers. "Margaret followed 3 days later. Couldn't bear the thought of leaving Rosalie alone in the ground, I reckon." Vera moved closer, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder with surprising warmth. "I'm sorry. Loss like that ... It changes a person's landscape forever." "Aye, it does." He looked up at her, seeing understanding in her eyes that went deeper than sympathy. Is that why you never married? Even before your Apache Brave? A shadow crossed her features. The men in Boston wanted a decoration, something pretty, to hang on their arm at church socials. They couldn't understand why I needed to teach, why books and learning mattered more than choosing wallpaper patterns. She laughed, but the sound held no humor. Then I came west thinking freedom meant something different here, only to find the same small minds in different clothes. Until I met Ayanna, I'd never known what it felt like to have someone see my soul instead of just my face. That evening, as they shared venison and wild onions around his fire, Cordell found himself talking about things he'd kept buried for years, his dreams of expanding the cabin, his loneliness that ran bone deep, his fear that he was becoming more wolf than man in his mountain solitude. Vera listened without judgment, her presence like balm on wounds he'd carried too long. When she reached across the space between them to touch his hand, electricity seemed to arc between their skin, and Cordell understood that healing sometimes came in forms you never expected. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "I can't go. Back to the settlement. And you? You've built a good life here." Cordell turned his palm up, his fingers closing gently around hers. "Maybe," he said, his voice rough with possibility, "we build something new together." Winter came early that year, blanketing their mountain sanctuary in silence, broken only by wind through the pines and the crack of splitting wood. Cordell had expanded the cabin's single room, adding a proper bedroom and a reading nook where Vera could pursue the books she'd salvaged from her burned schoolhouse. They moved around each other like dancers learning new steps, careful not to crowd the growing tenderness between them. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Vera confessed one evening as they sat before the fire, her head resting against Cordell's shoulder. "After Ayanna died, I thought my heart had died with him." Cordell's arm tightened around her, his lips brushing the crown of her golden hair. "Grief makes room for love, doesn't replace it," he said quietly. "You're Apache Brave. He'd want you to live, to find happiness where you can." She turned in his arms, her blue eyes reflecting firelight like captured stars. "And your Margaret? Would she approve of this mountain woman who's invaded your solitude?" "She'd say I was a fool for waiting so long to let someone in," he replied, his weathered hand cupping her cheek. "Margaret always believed hearts were meant to be shared, not hoarded like gold." Their first kiss tasted of wood smoke and wild honey, gentle as snowfall but carrying the promise of deeper passion. When they broke apart, both were breathless, and Vera saw in Cordell's eyes the same wonder she felt blooming in her own chest, but their peace was shattered 3 days later when Cordell returned from checking his trap lines to find boot prints. In the snow around their cabin, too many prints made by men who'd approached with purpose rather than wandering. "They were here," Vera said, her face pale as winter moonlight. 6 men, maybe 7. I hid in the root cellar like you taught me, but I heard them talking. Caldwell's offering a reward for information about my whereabouts." Cordell examined the tracks, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. The prints led to the tree line and disappeared, but their message was clear. Nowhere was truly safe from the Vigilance Committee's reach. "We can't stay here," he said, though the words tasted bitter as wormwood. This valley had been his sanctuary, his healing place, and the thought of abandoning it felt like tearing away part of his soul. "Where can we go?" Vera asked, her hand finding his with desperate need. "They'll hunt us wherever we run. Caldwell won't stop until he's made an example of me." Cordell studied her face in the dying light, seeing not the broken woman he'd cut down from that rope, but someone who'd found strength in survival, who'd learned that love was worth any risk. "There's a trading post 2 days' ride north," he said slowly, "run by a French trapper named Beaumont who has no love for vigilante justice. He might help us get passage on a supply wagon heading to California. Vera nodded, though he could see the fear beneath her brave facade. When do we leave? Tonight. Travel by darkness, rest during the day. It's our best chance. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the warmth of her body against his. I won't let them take you, Vera. Whatever happens, we face it together. As they packed their few belongings by lantern light, neither spoke. Of the life they were leaving behind or the uncertain future that stretched ahead like unmarked wilderness. They had each other, and in a world gone mad with hatred, that would have to be enough. The journey north through snow-laden passes tested every skill Cordell had learned during his years in the mountains. They traveled by starlight, following game trails invisible to untrained eyes, their horses' hooves muffled by thick snowfall that both concealed their tracks and threatened to trap them in deadly drifts. On the second night, as they sheltered in a cave overlooking a frozen stream, Vera shivered against his chest despite the small fire he'd built near the cave mouth. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that made Cordell's stomach clench with familiar fear. He'd seen that color before, during Margaret's final days. Tell me about California, she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. What? Do you think it's really like? Cordell pulled his bearskin coat tighter around them both, sharing what warmth he could. Stories say the land's green year-round, with flowers blooming in December and fruit hanging heavy on the trees. Might be tall tales, but a man can hope for somewhere warm enough to love without looking over his shoulder. She smiled at that. And even pale with cold, her face held a beauty that made his chest tight with emotions he was still learning to name. I want to teach again, she said. Find children who need letters and numbers, maybe some who speak Apache or Spanish alongside. English. You will, he promised, though privately he wondered if they'd survive long enough to see any dawn, let alone California's legendary sunshine. Their answer came at first light, when the sound of horses echoing off canyon walls announced the arrival of their worst fears. Cordell crept to the cave mouth and counted 7 riders picking their way up the narrow trail Caldwell's Vigilance Committee, armed with rifles and the kind of grim determination that had made them legends among frontier settlements. They found our tracks, he whispered to Vera, his mind racing through possibilities that all ended in hemp rope or bullets. Must have followed us from the trading post. Vera's face went white, but her voice remained steady. How long do we have? An hour, maybe less. Cordell checked his rifle, knowing 7 cartridges weren't enough against 7 men, especially when those men carried the righteousness of their cause like armor. There's a back way out of this cave, leads to a ledge above the waterfall. If we can reach it, ... double quotes. If? Vera caught his arm, her blue eyes searching his face for truths he didn't want to speak. Cordell cupped her cheek in his palm, memorizing the feel of her skin, the way morning light caught in her golden hair. If something happens to me, you keep running. Beaumont's post is 5 miles north. He'll help you reach Sacramento. No. The word came out fierce as any war cry. We stay together, Cordell. Whatever comes, we face it together. He wanted to argue, to insist she save herself, but the stubborn set of her jaw reminded him of another strong woman who'd refused to bend to any man's will. Instead, he kissed her with desperate tenderness, pouring 5 years of loneliness and 3 months of unexpected love into that single moment. Then we'd better move, he said against her lips. California's waiting. They gathered their few possessions with practiced efficiency, but as they reached the cave's back entrance, Caldwell's voice boomed off the canyon walls like thunder from an angry god. Vera Lightwood, I know you're up there. Come down peaceful-like, and we'll make this quick. Keep running, and we'll make sure it takes all day. Vera's hand found Cordell's in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his as they faced the narrow ledge that might lead to freedom or death. Behind them, boot heels rang against stone, and ahead lay only sky and the promise of flight. The ledge was narrow as a knife blade and slick with ice, but Cordell had walked worse paths during his mountain years. With Vera's hand clasped tightly in his, he guided her along the treacherous route while behind them, Caldwell's men shouted curses that echoed off the canyon walls like damning prayers. There! Caldwell's voice carried clearly in the thin air. On the waterfall ledge, Johnson, circle around to the north face. Patterson, you take the south. They got nowhere to run now. The frozen waterfall stretched below them in magnificent sheets of blue-white ice, beautiful and deadly as a cathedral. Made of crystal. Cordell could hear water running beneath the frozen surface, could smell the pine-scented mist that rose from where the stream continued its journey toward distant valleys. Can we climb down? Vera asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. The ice-covered rocks would provide no purchase for boots or hands, and a fall would mean death on the jagged stones below. Not unless we sprout wings, Cordell replied grimly, checking his rifle one more time. 6 shots against 7 men odds that would make a gambling man weep. But he'd faced worse chances during the Apache Wars, and love made a man capable of miracles. He'd never attempt for himself alone. The first of Caldwell's men appeared on the ledge behind them, rifle raised and ready. Cordell recognized Tom Patterson, a blacksmith's son who'd grown up mean and stayed that way, his face twisted with a kind of righteousness that justified any cruelty. End of the line, mountain man, Patterson called. Hand over the Apache Lover, and maybe we'll let you walk away from this. Her name is Vera, Cordell replied evenly, stepping between the rifle and the woman he'd grown to love more than his own life. And she's done nothing wrong except love someone you were too small-minded to understand. Patterson's laugh held no humor. Love? That's what you call it when a white woman spreads her legs for a savage? We got a different word for that kind of behavior. Vera stepped from behind Cordell, her chin raised with defiance that made his heart swell with pride. Ayanna was worth a dozen of you, Tom Patterson. He had more honor in his little finger than you'll ever possess in your entire body. Shut your mouth. Patterson snarled, swinging his rifle toward her. You corrupted our whole settlement with your heathen ways. Made other women think they could ignore God's natural order. That's when Cordell's rifle spoke, the shot echoing off canyon walls like thunder. Patterson spun and fell, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. But even as the blacksmith's son writhed on the ice-slick ledge, more men appeared. Johnson from the north, 2 others Cordell didn't recognize, and finally Caldwell himself, his face set in lines of implacable judgment. 4 against 2, Caldwell observed with grim satisfaction. I'd say the odds just shifted, wouldn't you? Vera's hand slipped into Cordell's coat, emerging with the pistol he'd insisted she carry. 4 against 2, she corrected, her voice steady as mountain stone. And we're fighting for love while you're fighting for hate. That makes all the difference. Cordell felt something shift in the air around them, a subtle change in pressure that he'd learned to recognize during his years among the peaks. Vera, he said quietly, do you trust me? With my life, she replied without hesitation. Then when I say jump, you jump. He glanced at the frozen waterfall below, calculating angles and distances with the desperate precision of a man who'd run out of conventional options. Aim for the deep pool at the bottom where the ice is thinnest. Caldwell raised his rifle with deliberate slowness, savoring this moment of triumph. Any last words, Apache Lover? Vera smiled then, an expression of such radiant joy that it transformed her face into something almost angelic. Just one, she said. Geronimo. And with that, she and Cordell leaped from the ledge into the crystal cathedral of the frozen falls. their hands clasped tight as they plummeted toward either death or the wildest freedom two lovers had ever dared to claim. The impact with the icy pool drove the breath from Cordell's lungs and sent shock waves through every bone in his body. But they were alive miraculously, impossibly alive. The thin ice had shattered under their combined weight, plunging them into water so cold it felt like liquid fire against their skin. Vera surfaced beside him, gasping and sputtering but whole, her golden hair streaming with droplets that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. "Can you swim?" he asked through chattering teeth, already pulling her toward the shore where pine boughs offered concealment from the men shouting curses far above their heads. "Like a fish," she managed, though her movements were clumsy with cold and shock. California girls learn early, even the ones who end up in mountains. They dragged themselves onto the rocky bank and into the shelter of ancient pines, their clothes freezing to their bodies as mountain wind cut through the wet fabric. Behind them, the waterfall roared its eternal song while above Caldwell's voice carried clearly in the thin air. "They're dead. Has to be. Nobody survives a fall like that." But his words held uncertainty, and Cordell could hear boots scrambling on stone as the vigilantes searched for a way down to confirm their victory. "We need to keep moving," Cordell whispered, wrapping his arms around Vera's shivering form. "There's a trapper's cabin about 2 miles downstream, abandoned but still sound. We can warm up there, dry our clothes before we freeze to death." The journey to the cabin tested every reserve of strength they possessed, but they made it as the sun reached its zenith, stumbling through the door of a one-room structure that smelled of old smoke and lonely years. Cordell quickly built a fire from the seasoned wood stacked against one wall while Vera stripped out of her frozen garments with fingers too numb to work the buttons properly. "Here," he said gently, helping her with the stubborn fastenings, his own hands shaking from more than cold as he revealed the pale perfection of her skin. They made love then beside the crackling fire, their bodies desperate for warmth and connection, their souls seeking confirmation that they had indeed survived the impossible. Afterward, wrapped in musty blankets while their clothes steamed on improvised lines, Vera traced patterns on Cordell's scarred chest with one finger. "Do you think they'll keep looking?" she asked quietly. "Caldwell will," he admitted. "Man like that doesn't give up easy." But we bought ourselves time, and time's what we need to reach Beaumont's post. They rested until darkness, then continued their journey through forests that grew gradually warmer as they descended toward the Sacramento Valley. 3 days later, they reached the French trader's rough-hewn establishment to find Beaumont himself waiting with a supply wagon bound for San Francisco and a grin that split his weathered face like sunrise. "Mon Dieu!" the Frenchman exclaimed, embracing Cordell like a long-lost brother. "I heard those vigilante dogs were hunting you. Good thing old Baptiste knows when to see nothing and hear less, eh?" The journey to California took 2 weeks through valleys where wildflowers bloomed even in winter and the air carried scents of orange blossoms and possibilities. Vera found work teaching the children of gold miners and Spanish families in a town called Angel's Camp, while Cordell built furniture with hands that had learned to create beauty from wounded wood. On their wedding day, 6 months after that desperate leap from the frozen waterfall, Vera wore a dress of California sunshine yellow and carried wildflowers that had no names in English. The minister was a former circuit rider who asked no questions about their past, and their witnesses were children from Vera's school who sang hymns in 3 languages. "To love without fear," Cordell whispered as he slipped a ring made from Sierra gold onto her finger. "To love without shame," Vera replied, her blue eyes bright with tears of joy rather than sorrow. And in the distance, mountains rose toward heaven like promises kept, while somewhere in the wind they could swear they heard the blessing of spirits who understood that love, in all its forms, was the only force strong enough to defeat hatred and heal the wounds that men inflict upon each other's hearts. Years later, their grandchildren would ask about the scars on Cordell's hands and the way Vera sometimes spoke Apache words to the flowers in her garden. But by then the stories had become legend, and legends belong to everyone who needs to believe that love can indeed conquer all.